turn to the introduction of Colm Tóibín. Colm was born in Enniscorthy, County Wexford, in 1955. He studied at University College Dublin, and he lived in Barcelona between 1975 and 1978. And out of that experience in Barcelona, he produced two books, the novel The South and Homage to Barcelona, both published in 1990. And when he returned to Ireland in 1978, he worked as a journalist for a variety of different periodicals and became features editor in Dublin in 1981 and editor of McGill, Ireland's current affairs magazine, in 1982. He left there in 1985 and travelled in Africa and South America, but his journalism from the 80s was collected in The Trial of the Generals, published in 1990. And he has other work as a journalist and travel writer, including a book that's of huge interest to us here in Liverpool, Bad Blood, A Walk Along the Irish Border, published in 1987, and The Sign of the Cross, Travels in Catholic Europe. And just to mention some of his novels, The Heather Blazing was published in 1992, The Master in 2004. He published Brooklyn in 2009. He's published a variety of different short story collections, starting with Mothers and Sons, and the second collection, The Empty Family, was published in 2010. His novel, The Testament of Mary, published in 2012, and of course that became a play which opened on Broadway with Fiona Shaw in April 2013. Nora Webster was published in 2014, and his ninth novel, House of Names, appeared in 2017. And also in 2017, he co-curated Henry James, An American Painting at the Morgan Library, because many of you will know that he's currently Mellon Professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia, alongside his heavy duties as Chancellor of the University of Liverpool. So, but one of the reasons why we're here to celebrate Colm's work is his new novel, The Magician. And I don't think that I will describe The Magician for you, except to say what you probably all know, which is that it's a portrait of the novelist Thomas Mann from youth to the end of his life. And, you know, it's great to be able to say that knowing that I'm not really giving the plot away. So, but we will now be talking about that novel, and I'm going to start with the most obvious question, which is, so why? What drew you to Thomas Mann?
In the 1970s, when I went to university, Thomas Mann was, this seems like history now, but he really was all the rage. And in the same way as you went to the film club and you saw, you know, weird French films, and you saw Antonioni Italian films, in the same way that you had the Magic Mountain under your arm, aged 18 or 19, in University College Dublin in 1972 or 73. And he was very well published at that time. And, you know, I believed then that novelists worked out of confidence and certainty in producing books, finishing them, publishing them, and getting on with their lives. I thought it was done as an act of, in a way, you know, self-assertion of some sort, but I didn't understand. I think the first time I did understand was when, I didn't understand that how much uncertainty, instability, insecurity, and anguish sometimes that fed into a book, much more than the things I thought. When I read that first biography of Virginia Woolf by her nephew, Quentin Bell, I really was shocked by the amount of pain. And not even writing the book would be, but the amount of even finishing the book would cause her so much anguish. So, it was, I think when you're 19 or 20, the idea of writing a book and finishing a book seems so extraordinary as an achievement that you have no idea that it could come from anything other than confidence. And so the first thing with Thomas Mann was that, he really was a towering figure in European culture. He was the most respected German alive, even during the Second World War, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1929. He was a father, he had 6 children, and he made long speeches, and even in America, in his exile, in his faltering English, as many as 6,000 people would come to hear him speak. He usually gave the same speech It was called The Coming Victory of Democracy. And it wasn't the coming defeat of Germany. It was to be about planning a future in Germany after the war. And so in his old age, he just simply, in his will, he just said, publish my diaries 35 years after my death. And then 35 is crossed out. It becomes 25. But in fact, it was 20. And his diaries really changed everything. It showed just how insecure he had been, but also gave an account of his secret erotic life, that all the time he was thinking about young men who he'd seen at a lecture, or he'd met once, or he'd kissed once. And so they really, poor scholars working on Death in Venice, thinking it was it's about a German writer going to Venice and seeing a beautiful, boy on the beach, thought it was about, that it was symbolic, it was about beauty, or it was about decay, or you realized it was actually just that he was in Venice the year before, and this is more or less what happened.
Yeah.
And this was helped enormously by his wife in her old age. She was an immensely tolerant and interesting woman, and she wrote her memoirs called Unwritten Memories. And she said, yeah, Tommy was in Venice, and he looked at a boy, and so this was followed then as by 3 biographies came out in English in 1996 in the same week. And they even further showed us how his politics were so insecure and really unreliable, and that a lot of his life was based on an effort to become plausible or to respond to a crisis in a way which he thought would be the most useful, and that he was not a hero in his own life or in his own family, but he was a faltering, fumbling, shivering sort of figure, much more than the man in the 3-piece suit on the podium. And I thought I could work with that. That interested me enormously, the gap between that mask or that plausible self, and also that all of his life he was haunted by loss. And the loss was an early loss, that he was born in Lübeck in 1875. His family went back a number of generations as a big commercial family in Lübeck, owning warehouses and ships. And he was the second son, and his mother had been born in Brazil, and there was a great trade between Brazil and Lübeck, because Lübeck was the center of marzipan making in Germany, so they needed all the sugar. And when he was in his early teens, his father died, and in his will said that the company was to be wound up, and he gave opinions on each of his children, and they were quite punishing, and he put a lot of guardians in charge of them all. And I think for the rest of his life, Thomas Mann resented this and had some sense that if only his father really knew him or knew what he'd achieved. In any case, he was useless in school, and they couldn't think what to do about him. And they found him a job in fire insurance, which really didn't suit him. And at the age of 25, he finished his first novel, a novel called Buttonbrooks, which became, I suppose, his most famous book. When he won the Nobel Prize in 1929, this was the book that was cited as his important book. And this was an attempt to recreate those 4 generations of Manns in Lübeck. He called them Buttonbrooks. And he put all of them in, the whole family story. His aunt, who married twice and had a lot of opinions, his father, the senator, who married this exotic woman, not from Brazil in the novel, but still nonetheless bringing in a sort of music of the violin into this very stolid, anti-musical, non-musical family. He rebuilt them brick by brick, moment by moment. That that if he could remake them, then it wouldn't be lost. What he did with the next generation was, instead of having 5, because he was a family of 5, he made himself into an only child, which I think is everyone's dream in Ireland. Coming from Irish large families, it only had just been me. And so that loss, I think, followed him. And so in Munich, from the age of 26, he was a really famous young writer. And he came to the attention of this family called the Pringsheims, who were assimilated Jews, tremendously rich and very cultured and bohemian and free-thinking. And he had actually cut a photograph out of a magazine when he was in Lübeck of this family. and he had it on his wall as an example of glamour. And in the same way as kids would have a pop singer now, he had this family. But when we went to Munich, they were older, and they eventually invited him to the house. And he met these twins, Klaus and his sister, Katja. And he married Katja. But I think I'm sure they were under no illusions about him, about his sexuality. And they sort of felt superior to him because, of course, they were Munich and he was just Lübeck. It was like coming up from Enniscorthy to Dublin or something. They never leave you alone about the fact that you're just not. And so this marriage began, and this novel is more than anything is a portrait of that marriage.
Yeah. I mean, you include the piece where you say that she says to someone, his wife says to someone, well, if I give him a particular kind of German wine, I know he's going to come to my bedroom later. So it was just like, so presumably 6 times for the 6 children.
Yes, and this wine, this special wine that makes him feel sort of horny. I mean, I did a lot of research on this.
Horny
and
indiscriminate.
I don't drink myself, but I asked a lot of people in Germany, is there one wine that you would think could be used for this purpose? And then I started to put it in. I'd finished the novel, so I started to add the wine to scenes. So on the night the Second World War ends, when it finally is over, that's the wine they have. But then when Thomas Mann is 75, and he's a bit depressed, he meets a waiter, a sort of fleshy Bavarian waiter, in a Swiss hotel, and takes a big shine to the waiter. And his wife and his daughter notice this. And instead of saying, stop it, you old goat, and give it up, they say to him, they arrange further meetings with him and the waiter alone. And in my novel, the waiter says, there's a wine, sir, I believe you particularly like. And it's that wine. So I got to use that wine a good number of times.
So you've talked obviously about the diaries changing everything, the publication of the diaries. You also use the diaries, and maybe we could come back to that later, as a kind of very important moment in the text as regards how he feels about himself in relation to Germany and other things. But can I just ask you, the research that you did to write the novel in the voice of Thomas Mann, how does it differ from researching for a biography? Why didn't you write a biography? Why have we got The Magician?
The interest I have is in using the facts as scaffolding in order to create a building, just put it like that. And so, take for example, I mean the only way I can really explain this is to give you an example. It is known that Thomas Mann's son Klaus committed suicide after the Second World War. So in 1949, Klaus Mann commits suicide. He's in the south of France. His father and his mother and his sister are in Stockholm. And they did not go to the funeral. His brother Michael went to the funeral and played music at the funeral. Now, there's very little else known about these days. So my interest is that fact is my scaffolding. I want then to begin to work as a novelist about what these days were like. That, each of them in Stockholm, in the hotel, behave in a different way. Each of them is in a different room. It's told entirely from Thomas Mann's perspective. But he's watching as his wife just, for the first time almost, loses it. At one stage on the phone says to her other son, don't tell me what to feel. And so she's speaking like that. He's silent because he just doesn't want to go to the funeral. And his wife, maybe, so he's trying to work out how to manage not to go without saying this. And what I'm working towards is I'm trying to find one image that will totalize, that will culminate, that will find a way of describing, this is not grief, this is shock. But it's a shock where these 3 people have to go over and over things that happened in the past. What he was like as a father. How they really cut Klaus, the son, loose at a certain point. How, all the things that each of them is thinking about. At one moment he just says, Thomas Mann, and this is from a letter he wrote to Hermann Hesse. He says, I just move it from the letter to what he says, he should not have done this to his mother. And of course Katja responds saying, don't tell me what he should have done. It's not a time for that. But what I'm looking for is something else. And it comes slowly. I try loads of things out. there's one person in the family has not been told, and that's Thomas Mann's brother Heinrich, who was very close to his nephew, and he's in California. And eventually, he manages to get through to his sister-in-law, Katia, to her room. And she just arrives in the room with the others to tell them, I've just spoken to Heinrich. And what I'm doing now is I'm working as a novelist. I'm setting up a scene. I'm building towards a moment. And this has absolutely nothing to do with the information, I mean, a biographer could do this too, but you have to use footnotes and facts to do this. But I'm working from imagination now, of her coming into the room. The problem is I've realized that I've not included Heinrich in who's been told. And I realized if I'm going to have one more person being told, I have to do something new. And she just says, I told him what happened. And we just stayed on the phone, and we didn't speak, and we didn't hang up. And just that image, it's not from, I've never heard of it, anyone doing it. It's not from biography, it's not from a biography of him, it's not from anything that ever happened to me. It's just something I imagined. I wanted one image of the starkest idea of what that would be like, of him staying on the phone, her staying on the phone, just the static of the phone, and neither of them hanging up, and them staying on for a while, and longer, and her coming to tell the story. So, I'm working as a novelist. I mean, in that scene, I'm attempting to build up from information into a set of scenes that I suppose ask you to enter the spirit of the person who's seeing all this, who's Thomas Mann, to live in his mind and to experience the drama that I'm trying to make, that I'm trying not to overdo all the time, because I don't want to move beyond the facts, but I'm imagining the scene.
Yeah.
So I suppose it is different in that sense, but it doesn't mean a biographer couldn't do this too with a scene, but you would need a letter or a diary to work from. And I don't have this in this case. And what's very helpful sometimes is to have as little as possible, merely to have these facts, and then I can go away with these facts and do really, I suppose, what I want with them. I mean, there's an element of, taking them and feeling free then.
Yeah. I mean, when you wrote The Master, you gave me, as a reader, my Henry James there. So I have no doubt that this is Thomas Mann, because I know less about Thomas Mann than I do about Henry James. But the voice of James there was just, for me, that was my Henry James. It resonated perfectly with how I would want to find him speaking in his voice about his family.
I think it would be arrogant and I think wrong for me. Like I didn't feel that with the Mann thing. I felt he's a much more ghostly figure than James. He tended to be very silent and not make much noise and watch the world. His real life was in his study when he closed that door, which he did for 4 hours every day. I was brightened up a bit, cheered up a bit by the fact that he in turn wrote a book, he wrote a book about Goethe in old age, a book called Lotte in Weimar, or the other title is The Beloved Returns. And it is him attempting to imagine the life of a much greater writer than he was. So I felt when I was doing this that I had that at least to justify what I was doing. But there's a sense in which he was a ghost in his own life.
That's very clear from the way you write him. He kind of barely inhabits the spaces, apart from and the kind of the attitude that he has toward that study, whichever house it's in. Yeah. It's almost kind of desperate. Yeah. Yeah. I
mean, he's a bit like some of the other characters that I have made. It's not as though I was interested in the idea of someone like a male character surrounded by women, who the women do all the moving and all the noise making, and all the excitement is created by women's voices, by women's presences, and this man is in the middle, and he doesn't have much to say and he doesn't have much to feel. There is an element here sometimes where his own feelings are brought down to zero. And he wrote a novel called Dr. Faucism, in which his character, everyone who loves him will be destroyed. And I think he was working out something absolutely fundamental in himself, feeling that somehow or other there was something that he was not he was not good at feeling, and he was not, as a father, as a brother, as a son, all those things, there's some element missing in him. And I was there is an element of him being a figure without qualities. I was sort of interested in what you could do with that. In the same way as if you were painting a portrait and the figure in your portrait just had no face or had some slight remnants of a face. I was trying to work something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Can we go back to Buttonbrooks? Because when I started to read it, I felt the air of Buttonbrooks. I mean, so that must have been deliberate, the way in which you chronicled the family to begin with. But then something subtly changes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's so much evidence about Thomas Mann because his novel Buttonbrooks is so much based on the facts. But we also have the facts from other people, and that extraordinary, the sense of belonging that he had from Lübeck, and that the fact that he was writing out of that, as the destruction of that. So I could work with that to start with, and there is a sort of a consoling, comforting feel to all that. And then once his father dies, I mean, he describes those holidays in Travemünde in Buttonbrooks, which is, the nearest seaside resort, and that, especially during that Germanic schooling that he got, having 4 weeks or 3 weeks holidays meant an awful lot, and he counted every day, and I sort of write about all that. But yeah, once his father dies, it's a different world in the novel, where he is cast out into the world, and he walks the streets of Munich at a certain point where he just wonders who all these people are. Would he ever get to know them? What would his life be? And then they find him this job in fire insurance. I mean, they're always trying to find me a job. When I was that age, I was thinking, there's a lovely job going, and they were telling me what the job was. And I was always trying to say, well, I actually love not to have a job for another while. And then, yeah, I think certainly fire insurance, but I was being threatened with worse, actually.
Yeah. So that certainty in Lübeck.
Yeah, and then you move out into where he becomes much more a watcher in the world. Yeah. His nose up against the pane glass of things, rather than someone who's enclosed, enfolded, and fully confident.
Yeah, and yet the act that you described, that he actually had a picture of that family into which he married on the wall. I mean, it's faintly creepy.
Yes, it's as though he imagined them, and then they satisfied his imagination enough that when he saw them, he just picked one of them. Yeah. It is creepy.
Or they picked him.
And they picked him too, because he was a famous young novelist, and they were friends with Wagner, and they were friends with Mahler, and here was another one.
He was a trophy. Yeah. Albeit
But the marriage became a much more complex thing than him being a mere trophy, because she was just so smart.
Yeah. Going back to Henry James, the way you set the master up, as a 5-year period, it's not to say that you limit yourself to that 5-year period. You go back in time through his memories, and particularly of family again. But the magician is the whole of life of Thomas Mann. So James has left America, and so America lives for him in his memory. Mann goes to America. Now, the Americas in these two novels are very, very different. So James's is kind of retrospectively bathed in, long hot summers with Minnie Temple to amuse him. Whereas, from the moment they arrive in New York, you feel a huge sense of, discomfort from him. And, I was kind of staggered by the Princeton kind of nonchalance. All of a sudden they've got a Nobel Prize winner on campus, and it's like they can barely be bothered to get him a work permit. What is going on in Mann's life at this point, and why are they so kind of...
I think the first thing is that he was 63 when he arrives in America, and he's really too old to begin to acclimatize. It will always be a foreign country. And his wife is busy learning phrasal verbs, and she's testing him every morning, to work it out, anyway, they're going through all those verbs every morning. But Princeton is an odd institution. It's, you know, it was, I mean, one of the reasons why Einstein, I mean, the rumor certainly always was that one of the reasons why they set up the institute, which is separate from the university in Princeton, was because they couldn't employ a Jew, you know, in the university. Einstein, you know, Einstein.
Yeah.
You know, they just didn't, Ivy League universities in general didn't make Jews professors, you know. I mean, American anti-Semitism, you know.
Yes.
And so having a Nobel, they had plenty of Nobel Prize winners, you know, it wouldn't have been, but the fact that he was a German at that very moment was probably not helpful. I mean, people didn't want Germans around. And you know, it was, he came to, and then they all moved west. Why they moved to Los Angeles? They moved partly they all thought they could make money with the movies. Some of them did, but most of them didn't. Really good weather, really cheap housing. But more than anything, the reason why all the German exiles, you know, including the composer Schoenberg and Heinrich Mann and Forkheimer, the sociologist, and Adorno, all of them moved, was that being a foreigner in those streets was not strange, as it would have been anywhere on the East Coast. That it was, LA is a city of foreigners, a big Jewish population, a big Korean, Chinese, Japanese populations, Mexican, so that it wasn't as odd to be there. There's one of those, a guy called Ludwig Marcuse. I came across him that he said, he spent 5 years in America, that he never willingly spoke to an American. You know, in other words, in the supermarket he would have to say thank you or something, but if a plumber came, he'd have to direct him to the leak. But he absolutely wanted nothing to do with his country other
completely an emigrant.
Yeah, and then the minute the war was over, he was back in Germany. And that was the case with most of them, really, that they just didn't. Thomas Mann, he did go to a few movies, but in general, he left with having no American friends. There was no question of that.
Yeah.
They were in exile, and they were going to go, you know.
Yeah, and yet, as you say, they worked hard on their English, and you know they thought they were going to have to assimilate. But
I mean, there's a big moment when Life magazine comes down to Princeton. This is 1939, and they want to take a photograph of this happy family, you know, to do something for propaganda. You know, that here is a happy family from Germany in Princeton. And the problem was that Thomas Mann's daughter Erica, who was lesbian, and she was in Amsterdam in about 1935, and her passport, German, was running out. And she saw Christopher Isherwood, and she knew he was gay, and she went up to him and said, "Will you marry me?" And he said, no, his mother wouldn't like that, and it wouldn't suit anybody really at all, but he knew someone who would. And they sent a telegram to Auden, W.H. Auden. And W.H. Auden was also a bachelor, and he replied, delighted. And so Erica put on her best suit and her best tie, and got her haircut even shorter, and went to England, and came home to her parents saying, "I've just married W.H. Auden." And she was, and Auden, I think, found her tedious, but he was glad to be helpful. I mean, he was a very good man in that way. But Life magazine wanted all of them, so Auden had to come down. And I just love, I mean, again, this is where a biographer...
You had a lot of fun in that scene.
You know,
right?
I used to teach in Princeton, and one of the things that I just couldn't ever believe was someone told me one day that the swimming pool, which you could, I was crossing the campus, and I could hear noises from the swimming pool. And jolly noises, you know, people diving and shouting. And someone told me that before women were allowed to be students in Princeton, that the men swam naked. And I used to think about this regularly as I was crossing the campus, thinking, imagine all these American boys diving in and coming out again, all of them naked. And then I give this thought to Thomas Mann a lot. And then, of course, Auden, Isherwood, and Klaus Mann come down, and they're late for lunch, and someone says, "Where are they?" "They're at the swimming pool." And again, the only evidence I have for this is that I used to think about this swimming pool. But I do have evidence that the photographers came and they take this wonderful family picture of this ostensibly happy, happy family without knowing anything about what's really going on among them. And it is in someone's diary where the photographer says about Isherwood, "But who's he in the family?" And Erica Mann says, "He's the family pimp," meaning he had found Auden for her. And so, you know, but then I can give lunch and I can have Auden talking, and then one of the problems that asylum seekers have generally is that it's very difficult to be rude if you're an asylum seeker. You tend to have to be polite and you want everyone to think well of you so they will let you into their country. But Thomas Mann realizes that he hasn't been able to be really rude to someone since 1933. And it's now 1939. It's 6 years of just been trying to make do in Switzerland and France and America. But he suddenly looks at Christopher Isherwood. Again, this is again me as a novelist. And he thinks, I think I'd like to be rude to him, this little fellow. Because he thought that Auden and Isherwood were laughing at him. And he was right, they were laughing at him. I mean, they just thought being a stiff German novelist was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And Auden was asked, who's the most boring writer in the world? He said, oh, my father-in-law. And they called Klaus Mann subordinate Klaus. I mean, they did do that. And so he decides to be rude to Isherwood. And that gets a lot off his chest.
Yeah, I mean, they are, they're behaving badly, aren't they? They're puerile and they're,
Well, he thinks they're laughing at him.
Yeah. But when you said he didn't have a relationship with anybody in America, I mean, he doesn't particularly like anybody, does he? I mean, he doesn't like Brecht, he doesn't like any of the emigres.
I mean, Brecht, he didn't like Brecht, and Brecht didn't like him, and neither was Sorry. I mean, it was, Brecht was left-wing. He believed that the German working class had been duped. He believed the working class would rise again. He thought that the war would end with, a rise of, and I suppose he was going to be happy in East Germany. The argument was a serious one. It was about what would happen to Germany after 1945. I mean, when it became clear that the Germans were going to lose the war, then the question became, where are we going to invest once more? Was Germany going to rise again as a great industrial power, economic power, and since it had twice disgraced itself, what would it do the third time? And so an argument began, which was one moment called the Morgenthau Plan in the Roosevelt administration, that Germany should grow cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, that we should cement over the Ruhr Valley, and no industrialization of any sort should ever be allowed again, market gardening, that it could just garden away and could pull up weeds because they were trouble. And Thomas Mann and his wife were involved in this, and Brecht particularly blamed Thomas Mann's wife because they had access to the White House. I mean, they stayed nights in the White House. And Roosevelt trusted as non-troublemaking, middle-of-the-road Germans who believed in the possible future. But Cathy Mann, I mean, the view was that that the German people had been were fully implicated in what had happened. And when someone said to Thomas Mann, you'll enjoy going back to Germany now the war's over and seeing old friends, he said, one or two maybe, but the rest make me shudder. And that was their feeling that Germany was irredeemable. And he didn't have this feeling forever, but he did have it, and his wife did have it, in crucial years like 1943. And this was a huge argument in America, which was won by the other side. I mean, it was the huge investment in Germany after the war. Yeah. But there were people really who did believe that this would end badly.
Yeah. I mean, he was just completely dispossessed, wasn't he? There was nowhere for him where he wanted to be.
Well, yeah, he lost his language. You see, it's really, if you imagine it, that say you're writing novels in English, and someone says to you, no, your novels are never going to be published in English again, ever, or in your lifetime. But you'll be published maybe if you're lucky in French or German, some other language, and you're writing these sentences, realizing, having been writing all your life, that these new sentences are going nowhere. So in 1933, he spent 3 years keeping a pact with the Germans that they would keep his books on display. His books were not burned in the initial fire of 33. And until 36, he did not openly denounce Hitler, just hoping that Hitler would fall of his own accord or something. And then in 36, he did. And then his books were banned. So there was when he was writing a sentence, think of it, he's writing a sentence, one of these big, long sentences, realizing no one is going to read this as I write it, perhaps in my lifetime and into the future. And that was a very serious thing for him and for others, except that he had an American readership. He was getting dollars in the 20s during the inflation years. The people he was with in California in the 40s had nothing. His brother Heinrich lost everything because he had no readership at all. And some of the other figures were absolutely poverty-stricken. Whereas the Manns built an astonishingly beautiful house in California in 1942.
Is it still there?
Oh, the Germans have just bought it and done it up beautifully. I mean, really, it is a lesson to us all in, beauty. And I mean, the bedrooms alone. He had a thing that we all must dream about, really. He had his study, and just outside his study, he had a staircase of his own. that he wanted to sneak upstairs to his own bedroom with a magnificent bathroom and a view of the Sierra and the water with view of the Pacific Ocean. He could sneak up there without having to go into the body of the house.
Yeah. They were never poor, were they?
No.
He was rich always.
No, I mean, she was tremendously rich, but also when that money ended, he at that time, oddly enough, writers got 25% of the cost of a book, which I don't know how that got to be halved. But
is your publisher in the room?
yes,
Yeah.
but she is. But it got to be halved. But so Buttonbrooks sold all over the world, regular. I mean, it became even better known as the years went on. But all these books did.
Yeah.
And it's strange, difficult books, because like The Magic Mountain became big books in America. Knopf's, his publishers, I think made Americans feel that if you're not reading these books, you're sort of nobody. And Americans don't like feeling like nobody.
And you said huge audiences when he turned up to give speeches.
Yeah, but a sort of hunger in those years for some hope that it was one German who could speak for some other Germany other than the one that had disgraced itself.
And then, so what happened when, after the war, McCarthy, etc.? I mean, what changed in the...
after the war was, first of all, Roosevelt dies, which really shocks him, and he has no connections in the White House. So then the atmosphere is beginning to change as the 40s go on, as the Cold War begins. So his problem is, what do you do when you go back? Everyone said Thomas Mann must come back to his own country and help rebuild it. And his son warned him, if you take political power, because there was talk about him becoming the president of a new Germany, they'll shoot you. I mean, someone will shoot you. But he didn't want to do this. And so he went back in 49, and Germany is divided into a western zone, eastern zone. And the Americans desperately don't want him to go into the East. And it will be propaganda for the other side. And his, very naively, has a view that I come from a language as much as I come from a country. And my language is German. And I will go to anywhere where that language is speaking. I belong there. And in the journey across Germany, and I mean, this really is not, I mean, this is proved. I mean, this is a fact. In other words, this is not a novelist. This is a fact. He stops, they stop in Bayreuth, where, Wagner had built his opera house. And they're staying in this posh hotel, and the manager is a simpering figure, can't leave them alone, and says, just sign the visitor's book. And he goes to sign the visitor's book, and this is 1949, and he just starts to flick back the pages. He finds Himmler, Goering, the whole lot of them, villainous lot of them, have also signed this book in the past, and the book is still there. And so he has a creepy feeling about, I was trying to get an image. I want an image now, because I keep working towards, give me an image, stop giving me information, give me an image. What could really be the moment that would make him feel sickest? And he has to go back to Munich. And what's happened in Munich is that Bavaria, rural Bavaria, has moved into the city. So cosmopolitan, Jewish Munich has come to an end, and now the farmers have arrived. And as he says, even shaking hands, not only knowing what blood these hands, But there's a wonderful moment in Ulysses where Leopold Bloom goes into, just before he goes into Davy Byrne's, where he has his lunch of gorgonzola and wine, he goes into another place, and he watches people eating in the most horrible way, the gluttony. He's a fastidious man, Leopold Bloom, in Ulysses, and he just, the gluttony makes him sick, so he doesn't go in there. And I'd been reading that and thinking about it, and I thought, so Thomas Mann goes for this dinner in celebration of him, and infinite amounts of food keep coming, big things of pork, big things of beef, big things of gravy, big things of potatoes, and everyone's ordering more, and he's just sitting there, fastidious. He was away during this war, and eventually he just wants to leave. But he does go into East Germany, and the Americans don't forgive him for that. And so when he goes back to America, the FBI get on his case, and they come for his daughter first. She doesn't have citizenship. So they come and do day-long interviews with Erika Mann about being what's called an early anti-fascist, which means, I suppose, a communist, perhaps. But they did accuse her of being a communist, and they accused her of incest, and they went into her sexual, career, or secret history in a way which was intolerable, and then they began to interview Thomas Mann himself over his this very conservative figure being accused now as being a fellow traveller. And he was accused in Congress of being a fellow traveller, and his name became associated suddenly with left-wing communism, Soviet stuff, and they decided to go.
So in fact the direct kind of interrogation never happened in Germany. The Nazis never came for him, literally, but they came for him in the US, which is ironic.
But he does feel, I mean, I did want to put this in proportion, that, look, if he had been interrogated by the Nazis, they would have killed him. I mean, he would have had no hope if they'd ever got their hands on him. Whereas the FBI, you feel like it is light. In other words, the most they can do to him is, you know, I mean, they're not even going to charge him.
No.
So he realizes it's not to be compared, this interrogation. But they do want to go.
Yeah.
And so in 1952, they set out again. And it's funny about this setting out thing. You know, his desk he got out of Munich when Hitler came to power, brought it to Switzerland, brought it to Princeton, brought it to California, and now is bringing it back to Europe. The paintings, a candelabra coming from Lübeck came with him all the way. So it's a strange idea of these possessions. So he goes back to Switzerland, and he has one more book. And I love this moment where he can write one more book, and he's known for being weighty, scholarly, difficult. So he goes back 40 years to a story he wrote called Felix Krull, about a chancellor, a confidence man, a sort of trickster. And it's out of that Central European tradition, like of Quixote or of Rabelais, of those sort of chancellor figures who are always at the edge of the carnival, picking your pocket and getting away with it. And out of sort of comic folktale. And he writes this last novel. And he puts things that he was known for or did himself in his own life into the book. But him as a trickster, him as a confidence man. And there's a lovely moment at the end of his life where he's actually just facing the light and writing a funny book about someone who, you should not take seriously. And there's an element of him at the end of his life feeling that he had all his life been trying out roles, the role of father, the role of great writer, the role as great visionary, as a Democrat, as an anti-fascist. But in all of those roles, he was really uneasy. There was no certainty in him like that. There was no solidity in him. So but at the end of his life, he found a way of writing about this in a book.
Yeah. Before I open it up to the floor, could you say a little bit more about the diaries and the way in which you not necessarily used them, but talked about his use of them?
I think that, especially with, being gay, where it's very difficult to be fully secret. In other words, people talk about being in the closet or how much silence there was around homosexuality. But the general thing would be that you always wanted one person to know, that having no one know would be intolerable. I never knew anyone in Ireland in all the years who told no one. And then I became interested in Roger Casement's diaries. For example, he was in the Congo, and he was in the Amazon, and he kept diaries which were filled with sort of details about his work as a humanitarian. They're called white diaries. But he also kept black diaries, which were not in sentences, but just in little notes to himself over how much sex he had with men, how much he paid, or details about them, about their anatomies. And this is odd. Why did he do this? And why did he keep these diaries? And my idea would be that it was the art of being found out, that there was that he needed some record, so that silence would not be the only thing. And of course, these diaries were used against him, and they caused him to be executed. I mean, they were shown to the American ambassador, the Archbishop of Canterbury. All were appealing for clemency when he was sentenced to death for his involvement in the 1916, in importing arms into Ireland in 1916 from Germany. So too with Thomas Mann, that even, in 1933, when he was in Switzerland. His house was still there in Munich. And in the safe, in his study, locked in the safe, were his diaries. And he organized his son to say, he realized that the Nazis would eventually ransack his house and eventually would want to know what was in that safe. So he had them freight mailed to him. And of course, they didn't arrive. And anyone who's ever waited for a check, knows this feeling of looking at the postman, every day. But I mean, days, weeks went by and they didn't arrive. Eventually, they did arrive. But in that period, he realized how he could be ruined and that his pose as a respectable father of 6, all that stuff would just go. He would be seen in some other light. And he was desperate. And when the diaries came, he burned some of them, but he kept all the rest, and he noted things in them. It's interesting about sex as well here, where he met on holidays in 1927, he met a family who had a 17-year-old son, and he fell in love with this boy, and the boy came back with the Mann family to Munich. And the only thing seems to have happened between them was a kiss. But as a novelist, it's interesting to work with the idea of a kiss, because we've won so much freedom to describe sex in such detail, which has been an important victory. But that not to do it, just to build up over pages, a whole chapter, just one kiss, and then remembering it later, because in the diaries later, the published diaries, he says, those lips of his I have kissed. And so it was something that he thought about a great deal. But, he was very secretive. But at the same time, his wife understood everything, I think, watched everything and understood it. And then he kept most of his diaries.
But even the terror that the Nazis might read those diaries wasn't enough to stop him from carrying on, right?
Stopping from doing it. He wanted to be known, and he spent his life not being known. He put so much energy into creating alibis or creating masks or veils that realized that in posthumously he could be known, and that his work therefore would be read in an entirely different way once these diaries were published, as it is. So from the grave, he dictated, and so the diaries were. I mean, you can just imagine the consternation when they were published.
Yes, absolutely. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and there is a roving mic, and I think there's a roving mic, one right here at the front, down here. The roving mic is terrifying, by the way.
Oh my God, the roving mic looks like a major weapon of mass destruction.
It does. She's not going to assault you with it. She's going to. So here we go.
Colm, I've read most of your books. I found what you said at the end very moving. I'm a gay man, and what you wrote about the kiss. I think the kind of reverse historical counterpoint of Thomas Mann, his son, Pious Dance is one of my favourite books, and also the Klaus called Across the Centuries to another gay man in a pathetic symphony. I'm looking forward to reading that book. I wonder what you felt about that kind of weird reverse. Klaus was quite open, sort of glass closet open, between Mann and Klaus.
This boy, Klaus Hauser, in my novel, he's terribly confident, and he really does what he likes. He behaves like an adult. And Thomas Mann notices with his family, he just doesn't ever ask for permission for anything. And he says, no, my father fought in the First World War, and he made a rule after the war that he would never, ever tell anyone else what to do. So with me, he just never told me what to do, and so I've never been told what to do. And Thomas Mann realizes that, of course, that's what they've done with their own children, but by accident, they didn't have a policy. They just sort of forgot to tell them what to do, because they were so busy with other things. I mean, Cathy, his wife, was in a sanatorium with TB. Thomas was writing his book, so the children just sort of grew. The two eldest, they grew, and they did what they liked, they said what they liked, they wore what they liked, and they slept with whomsoever they liked. And Klaus, his son, became a writer, and he wrote Mephisto, and so certainly the tension between father and son was that the father was this buttoned-up, closeted homosexual, and his son was out there in the world, was just having a whale of a time. And Thomas Mann saw in that the beginning of destruction. In other words, he did envy it. He did see it as being a new world that he wished he'd experienced. But he also saw the beginning of morphine, taking drugs, saw Klaus's interest in touring the world, in going to New York, in going to Persia, in just as that this would end badly. That this would not, that he did not have some sort of interest in being alone and silent in a room for 4 hours a day as part of his life. That he just didn't have this, and so we see early on the beginnings of the problem there's going to be, where Klaus is also so political. And I mean, he's a very decent fellow. I mean, he feels that he must struggle against Hitler in every possible way, and that writers have a duty and responsibility to do this in the most active ways. His father doesn't feel this. But the main thing is the gay thing, that his father knows that Klaus is out there as we speak, having a wonderful time, while his father is about to go back in and read Schiller under lamplight. And it's no fun. So...
Yes, there.
Thank you. Hi, Colm. I really love your work, as probably everybody does, but I really enjoyed your book about Elizabeth Bishop, and I wondered if you're going to write a novel about Elizabeth Bishop soon. Thank you.
I could write about the James, or I was impelled or inspired to write about the Henry James and about Mann, because I didn't understand them, and there were so many things in them that were ambiguous, often the opposites. I couldn't see them, and therefore I felt that I could work with that. That if I had clarity, I couldn't deal with that. I think I have a pretty good version, I think, of Oscar Wilde, for example. So I couldn't write a novel about him because there's nothing I would need to explore. And I would feel the same about, say, George Eliot. With Bishop, you can't write about her without writing about the poetry. And therefore, I really wanted to write about her. And I particularly wanted to write about all that way that she dealt with loss. Because in The Magician, that's really what I'm working about, is what happens after loss. What's a life led in the shadow of a complete loss of an entire heritage. And she wrote the famous poem, The Art of Losing. But in that poem, she doesn't name the big things she lost. It's in a letter where she says, I lost my mother, I lost my father, I lost my lover. But she doesn't put those words into the poem, and I became fascinated by that distance. But I didn't want to write a novel about her. I thought that if I just stuck to the facts and wrote about the poetry, that I would be on safer ground. So I didn't do it, and I'm not going to do it. So you can.
That was clear, I think. Yes. Just here.
Hello there. You mentioned sanatoria, just a moment ago. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a bit more about that in relation to Mann, and perhaps slightly more frivolously, do you know what the name of that wine is?
It's in the book. I'll find it for you after.
Okay.
And I mean, it does exist, and it does do the trick. I'm told, Thomas Mann's wife was diagnosed with tuberculosis. This is about 1913, and she goes to Davos to the sanatorium. And so the real problem we have is that she wrote constantly to him, but those letters were lost in the Second World War. I mean, they were in their lawyer's office, and that was destroyed. So we don't have those letters, which is a real pity, because they must have been wonderful. He goes to see her eventually, and that account of him going to see her is the account in his novel The Magic Mountain of Hans Castorp going to see his cousin, that moving from sort of lowland to up into Davos. And in the novel, Hans Castorp goes for 3 weeks and ends up staying 7 years. But in the But also, when he arrived, he moved into a fully enclosed world with its own news and its own gossip, as though the rest of the world did not exist. So that his wife was filled with news of the bad Russian table, the good Russian table, the people who made noise having sex in the next room. So all that world of gossip in the Magic Mountain comes from those 3 weeks. What he did then was, it's a wonderful version of how fiction is made. From that small visit, he then proceeded to think of a novel, which he began to think about in 1914. But when the First World War broke out, he really went insane. It's one of the really hard things to do in this novel, because he became a fired-up Prussian patriot, and he wanted bloodshed. He sounds like Patrick Pearse. And his brother was almost a pacifist, but I suppose he became like a lot of people in that month in 1914 did in England, and indeed in Ireland with the 1916 rebellion. Something happened in those few years, and he stopped writing the book, and he wrote an extraordinary book called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, where he attempted to look at what Germany meant, and what its heritage was, what its culture was, and what its artists meant. And it couldn't be worse, this book. It's a really good example that writers should not think they should write, and that thinking is not a natural thing for anybody, really, maybe, and that very few rare people are able to think. But it's just been reissued, and it's really worth reading if you ever feel depressed about your own work. Feel that I've never done anything as bad as this. And when the war ended, and he was a monarchist. He was. So when the war ended, he went back to the book, and he himself changed with the destruction of the war, and became a sort of Democrat. He became a more intense Democrat later, but he changed from 1919 onwards, and he published The Magic Mountain, in 1924. And so he had had these years of silence, of not writing any fiction, and that transformed the way he imagined these 3 weeks. And he made The Magic Mountain into a great book about arguments about being and philosophy and the meaning of Europe and the meaning of art. And it becomes a big, it's a big blockbuster debate novel, as well as having like the description of the first X-rays, and so it's a very interesting moment where he, from very little, he got this huge book, which again changed his reputation enormously. What his wife says, this is going to change everything for you, and it did. Some of the book his wife found very funny, because she was reading about things that she had told him, watching him transform them. And his son Golo said, she's laughing. And I said, she's reading my book. What, reading one of your books and laughing? Because it was a new idea for the son that, the magician didn't write funny books.
They were always very mean to him. So we've come to the end of our time. I know that, like me, I'm sure most members of the audience could really listen to you talk all night. But
don't encourage me.
Yeah. But I would like to invite the audience to join me in thanking the wonderful Colm Tóibín.
Thank you very much.